Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you for turning on the music. Good afternoon, everyone in the room, and greetings to our online guests joining from various time zones around the world. My name is Mark Plant. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this session entitled State Building in Protracted Crises, Lessons and Future Directions. I think if we had held this session 10 years ago, there might have existed a broad international consensus on how global partners can intervene effectively to support nations grappling with protracted crises. That focus then was on establishing the foundational elements of a functioning state that could adequately address the needs and aspirations of its populace. The international community would work together, with each partner offering its own expertise in its area of comparative advantage. A great vision. However, the landscape has evolved significantly since then, marred not only by escalated global conflicts, but also by the sobering realization that perhaps the previously touted approaches have fallen short. And the case of Afghanistan is a poignant example of international failure. What exactly went awry? Was it an inherent flaw in the model of the state itself? Did local stakeholders resist or fail to embrace the assistance framework that others offered them? Were the partners unable to execute their assistance plans effectively, hindered by political or technical or interinstitutional constraints? Or did the intricate web of global politics undermine the entire enterprise? Reflections on what went wrong, and perhaps more importantly, on what went right, will help the global community today looking for a way forward. We're in a difficult environment and we need lessons, good and bad, from the past. And it's those lessons that we're going to look for today. We have a distinguished panel to enlighten us. Let me introduce them to you. To my left is Minister Kenya Barley, the Minister of Planning and Economic Development for Sierra Leone and the chair of the G7+. She's a consummate development planner with over 35 years of experience in planning and economic development, working with both governmental and international organizations. Before being minister, her most recent assignment was as a member of the executive board of the African Development Bank, where she represented the constituency of the Gambia, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Sudan. Online, we have Dr. Mustafa Al-Hiti, the former head of the Iraq Reconstruction Fund. He led the fund's effort to coordinate urgent reconstruction activities in the areas of Iraq damaged by terroristic activities, development plans for mid and long-term reconstruction, and he served as the link between international organizations and Iraqi governmental institutions. Nigel Roberts, to my far left, has more than 40 years of experience to his credit as an expert in international development, economics, and politics. Since 2012, he has been an independent consultant, conflict consultant, and a managing partner for Strategies for Stability, LLC. He works alongside various worldwide governmental organizations to develop initiatives that aid in the economic management of political and financial stability. And online, we also have Tobias Haq, who is the lead country economist and program leader for Pakistan. Tobias has worked for the World Bank for more than a decade, spending time in a range of economist roles based in Pakistan, Afghanistan, here in Washington, in Sydney, and the Pacific Islands. He previously worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in the private sector consulting, and in the New Zealand Public Service, where he began his career at the New Zealand Treasury. Without further ado, let's start with Tobias, who will give a perhaps more detailed and longer framing of the questions we're going to pose today. Tobias, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's great to see everyone, and thank you so much for joining. As you say, I would like to use my time to just frame this discussion a little bit better. I think with a particular emphasis on my experience in Afghanistan, where I worked on the program with the World Bank for 5 years, but drawing a little bit more broadly. What I'd like to do is outline what I see as the implicit intervention logic we use when engaging in fragile states and challenge some of the key aspects of that intervention logic. I think we start with this quite simple intervention logic and we apply it in various ways, but with a great deal of consistency in many of the varied contexts in which we work. And this intervention logic goes something like this, right? It's basically this idea that countries emerging from conflict have dysfunctional institutions. And the absence of functional institutions political institutions and economic institutions, leads to poor development outcomes. The state is not accountable to citizens, property rights are weak, the government engages in predation and rent seeking. Because of that, markets can't operate effectively, right? So social resource allocation is inefficient and rates of growth are low, output is low. The objective of development interventions in that context is to build the institutions that support accountable states and functional markets. So we support government transparency, we support government efficiency and service delivery. And we try and work towards this overall project of making markets work, eliminating rent-seeking opportunities, eliminating dysfunctions in markets by having the government finance a select set of public goods, deliver those efficiently, and then allow markets with secure property rights to function effectively and respond to price signals to drive growth. As a result of those kind of institutional reforms that are being supported by the international community, we expect to see public services improve, markets become more efficient, overall progress towards development. And finally, as a result, the last step of this chain, as those development goals are achieved, we expect to see state legitimacy. We expect to see the general public, powerful groups, elites recognize the development gains delivered by the government, recognize service delivery by the government and improving economic opportunities, and that to be reflected in state legitimacy, and that state legitimacy to underpin broader improvements in social stability and lead to the reduction and escape from violence and conflict. So it's a very coherent model, but I think there's two key challenges here. Firstly, the idea that outsiders can build institutions for effective governments and efficient markets in short time periods, I think is very challenging and not really supported by the experience today. If we think of institutions not as pieces of paper or formal rules, but rather as systems and processes that guide behavior and determine distributional outcomes, it becomes clear that these are very political processes. In post-conflict states, there's no monopoly on violence, there's no overarching state power. So it's very difficult to make sure that these formal rules are imposed, these formal rules are enforced. And because those that are benefiting from the informal rules that exist, often the systems of patronage, because elites require those systems of patronage to hold bargains together, they are very resistant to following those imported institutional forms. So we see this divergence between imported institutional forms and actual practice. And I think this has been very well documented in many countries in the developing world, but especially in fragile states. So for example, in Afghanistan, despite 20 years of institution building effort, we really saw no impact on the CPIA scores or the World Governance Indicator scores, despite literally hundreds of reforms to policies, institutions, legislation, regulations, right? So this divergence between the formal and the informal becomes a binding constraint because those with power and influence are reluctant to obey or enforce the formal rules that are being imposed. I think the second problem that comes into play with our model is this assumption that improved services and improved economic outcomes leads to peace and stability, leads to state legitimacy. There's actually very little evidence for this in the international literature, which really shows that the relationship between economic outcomes, service delivery, and peace and stability is much more complex. And that evidence really suggests that it's much more about perceived fairness and equity. It's about the absence of predation or exploitation. It's about people feeling that they're being treated fairly and with respect. And if services or economic opportunities are provided in a context without that fairness, it can actually be destabilizing because people feel that they are having unequal access to those opportunities, and that can fuel and intensify contestation, right? So this assumed link between economic growth, service delivery, and improved state stability, absence of violence, again, a challenging assumption. So what does all of this mean for us? What lessons should we be taking forwards from this if this is what we've found from our experience over the past 20 or 30 years? I think overall we need to be more modest in our ambitions and work more slowly and carefully in state building contexts. Obviously, development agencies work in a political context of our own, and that can frequently push us towards big promises, large projects, rapid disbursement, trying to do as much as we can as fast as we can. And that pressure is often very political and it's very prevalent, but I think it needs to be challenged. We need to focus now more on setting realistic goals, even if changes are incremental. We need to work on investing and understanding the context and understanding the politics where we work, even if that slows us down and makes delivery more costly and transaction intensive. We need to think about making incremental change and then measuring the results of what we're doing and changing course when things go off track. So feeling our way, making incremental change rather than coming in with an overarching imported model and trying to impose that on a very complex system. Let me stop there, but I mean, I really wanted to just put some challenging thoughts on the table, and I'm very interested to see how our panelists and any of the audience would like to react. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. And I think you lay the ground well, that we have to be modest in our ambitions, skeptical of our ability to build institutions quickly, and skeptical of the link between government provision and then peace. It's much more complicated than that. Nigel, perhaps you can offer some more on-the-ground insights.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about Palestine today. The premise of a blog that Tobias and I wrote recently for the bank is that the liberal economic and institutional pathways we pursue in search of sustainable peace are often subverted by geopolitical goals and domestic political structures, which are at odds with our playbook. Tobias has spoken somewhat about Afghanistan. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And there are many other examples where the bank and donor perspectives work at cross purposes with political realities, sometimes to their detriment and sometimes to their benefit. In Nepal, for example, donors have bemoaned the corruption and fecklessness of successive post-Civil War administrations without really grasping that the money made available to post-revolutionary leaders via a leaky aid system provided a major incentive for them to fight in parliament rather than return to the battlefield, because their rebellion had given them access to rents and patronage formerly denied to them. So while we're celebrating that comment, perhaps, okay, great. So the bank's history in the occupied Palestinian territories, what I'll refer to today as Palestine, consistent with Anna Bierde's opening remarks yesterday, illustrates how our institution can become strategically paralyzed by reluctance to acknowledge and adjust to major shifts in the political environment. First, though, a short digression on politics and the bank. The bank's articles of association, as most of you will know, require from the bank and its officers that only economic considerations shall be relevant to their decisions. Well, the notion that economics is not politics, particularly for an institution dedicated to the eradication of poverty and thereby to a measure of redistribution, is clearly absurd. But it's a useful absurdity in the right hands, because it permits the bank to use technocratic language to analyze sensitive political questions. Here, perhaps it's useful to distinguish between the bank's board, an explicitly political body that represents the interests of its shareholders, and the bank's professional staff, who are better placed to exercise political neutrality and thereby to give sound, informed technical advice to the political decision makers on the board. One of the major criticisms of the bank's performance in Afghanistan, highlighted in the report that Tobias Atik Ahmadzei and I wrote in 2022, was the failure by bank management to thoroughly interrogate the unrealistic state-building strategy which the bank had been asked to help implement. There was a tendency, and I understand that as a former bank country director, to lean into what management believed powerful shareholders, in this case the US and its NATO allies, wanted done, rather than what bank analysis and experience warned against doing. Ultimately, bank staff do need to follow the board's directions, but doing our job properly and helping them do theirs should mean telling them what the potential consequences of particular courses of action are, whether they like it or not. Anyway, to Palestine. When the bank became involved there 32 years ago, it was a unique and optional engagement. Palestine wasn't and isn't a member of the bank. We were invited by the co-sponsors of the Madrid peace process to provide the economic underpinnings for a land for peace settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, with the board deciding it was in the interests of the global membership of the bank that we do so. Thus, we found ourselves supporting the Oslo peace process, and through that, the creation of a Palestinian state. Within a very few years, though, the original hopes evaporated in mutual distrust, the continued expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and increasing violence against both Israeli and Palestinian civilians. We can argue about the exact point at which the Oslo process ran aground, but wherever you locate it, that particular two-state peace model died well over a decade ago, degenerating into sustained conflict and a de facto one-state reality. And yet, the bank remained engaged in activities pursuant to the creation of a Palestinian state, building Palestinian state institutions, supporting Palestinian fiscal management, developing national service delivery, and the provision, or at least the wish to provide, the infrastructure appropriate to a future state. Bank staff certainly wrestled with the disconnect between the program and the disappearing possibility of Palestinian statehood. Even though the specific original objectives of our engagement had been invalidated, nonetheless we stayed. And I believe the bank was right to remain engaged in supporting Palestinian welfare in a crippled economy. But we should have made it clear why we were still engaged, and we should have adjusted our program to fit this new reality. Why didn't we do so? Because maintaining the illusion of a peace process suited the US, Europe, Israel, and even the region in various ways. And the bank did not believe it would be appropriate to challenge this illusion. That, it was felt, would be making explicit political judgments. What this reticence fails to acknowledge, though, is that being political has two sides to it. One is taking an overt political position. The other is to permit yourself to be instrumentalized for someone else's political purposes. By remaining silent, the bank allowed itself to become part of a progressive normalization of occupation, settlement expansion, and the marginalization of Palestinian national aspirations. Then came the horrors of October the 7th and their aftermath, and the bank's response to these shocking events. There was a communication response and an operational response. Bank communication is important. As a global institution, the bank's views matter, and what it chooses to say or not to say influence its credibility and its capacity to work effectively. Bank management was quick to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Hamas's atrocities on October 7th, and rightly so. It has been a lot more hesitant to acknowledge the excessive violence against Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The Gazan economy, in the words of the bank's own most recent economic note, has experienced one of the biggest shocks in recent economic history, with GDP plummeting by over 80% in the fourth quarter of 2023 alone. Gaza also contains over 80% of the global total of those deemed catastrophically food short under the IPC system. Over 95% of Gazans are considered multidimensionally poor by the UN. Speaking to the intolerability and injustice of this situation, letting the facts tell the story is surely consistent with the bank's mandate as a humane development organization. Silence in the face of this tragedy, though, would be a political choice, and one that is unlikely to be forgotten. Operationally, I believe the bank has got it right up to this point. The bank's resources are limited by Palestine's inability to draw on IDA and the program's reliance on relatively small sums of net income. But the bank has done what it can within these constraints. It's provided $35 million, mainly in reprogrammed funds for humanitarian relief in Gaza, working through the UN. Last week, the bank announced a $30 million grant to help preserve some continuity in Palestinian children's education. In addition, the bank has carried out bi-weekly Gaza damage assessments and has just released this powerful note on the impact of the war on the Palestinian economy. This combination of humanitarian relief, of activities that aim to strengthen Palestinian resilience, and of analytical reporting, to me, represents sensible, realistic adaptations to a vastly changed political context. The next steps will be more difficult. Bank management rightly insists on remaining engaged in difficult situations of this kind. The question, though, is what that engagement will consist of and how it will be explained. And these are non-trivial matters, given the internal and external scrutiny that the institution will be under. The President has sensibly decided to solicit advice from a group of high-level and external experts. There is talk in diplomatic circles about declaring a Palestinian state, which has, of course, already been recognized by 139 countries, though not by those who might help turn this notion into a reality. There is also talk about reviving the two-state solution, without much discussion of what that would look like today or how it could be brought about. After Oslo, if we go back there and look at what happened before and after 1993, this will give you some sense of how the complications of resolving this problem have changed. So in the 26 years prior to Oslo, after the Six-Day War in 1967 to 1993, some 100,000 Israelis settled in the West Bank. That number excludes Jerusalem. In the next 26 years, under the Oslo peace process, no less, this number quadrupled to 400,000. And if you include the area of Jerusalem beyond the 67 borders, the settler total is nearly 700,000 today. It's quite unclear to me how this critical issue, the presence of Israeli settlements and settlement infrastructure throughout the West Bank, can be addressed, even with land swaps, without levels of coercion impossible to imagine in today's Israel. The moderate Palestinian and Israeli pluralities who supported the classic Oslo two-state solution have been displaced by increasingly radical violent extremists and the room for compromise has narrowed considerably over the past 3 decades. More likely than any real breakthrough is some patched together compromise and the continuation of the conflict under revised terms. The appointment of a Palestinian government of technocrats rather than any true reform of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. A continued Israeli presence, intermittent or permanent, in Gaza. A contested Palestinian governance environment in both Gaza and the West Bank, with potential militia-style fragmentation and further radicalization. A lack of bankable guarantees against further Israeli offensives, and a flaccid response from the Gulf donors and private investors whose money is essential for the reconstruction of Gaza. Under such a scenario, a truly dismal one for both Israelis and Palestinians, a continued bank focus on preserving Palestinian human and institutional capital looks, modest and unexciting as it may appear, like the most sensible course of action. I hope those advising the president are sensitive to the reputational risks to the bank if it participates in initiatives that ultimately serve to perpetuate occupation, settlement, and violence. I do not believe the bank should allow itself to be drawn into a high-profile reconstruction effort unless this is underpinned by a political program offering credible assurances of Palestinian statehood. It may sound semantic, but to me, there's a key difference between supporting Palestinian resilience by helping repair essential infrastructure and subscribing to a showcase reconstruction program that proceeds with the key political parameters left unaddressed and thereby risks further major asset destruction down the road. And finally, a particular dilemma arises when it comes to helping displaced Gazans, the vast majority now. Much of Gaza is uninhabitable and will remain so for a long time to come. In a more benign world, Gazans would move to some more hospitable place until a modicum of normality had been restored to their former neighborhoods. But were this to be outside Gaza, such a move could lead to permanent exile, as has been the case with the 1948 and the 1967 refugees. Recent aerial images of construction on the western side of the Philadelphia corridor in Egypt have fueled suspicions, and the bank should be very careful not to involve itself in supporting any kind of mass cross-border displacement, however justified this support may seem from a purely humanitarian viewpoint. Should the bank become associated with forced displacement, this would skirt the limits of legality and would be seen by many as a betrayal of 30 years of bank commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state and to the resolution of this 100-year-old war. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, for that very sobering reminder of the current difficulties and how the global politics, regional politics, technocrats, technical challenges combined to make a very difficult and challenging terrain for intervention. Let's turn next to Minister Barley for her reflections from a region that is known to be a fragile region. And you have great experience in this area. Please, Minister.
Thank you, Mark. Well, with reference to state building and whether that's the way forward, whether we should have new models, I would like to say that in the aftermath of protracted wars, like the 11 years in Sierra Leone, we know that the international community usually steps in to address the devastating effects of the wars, to restore peace and rebuild what was destroyed. This is what state building entails. But state building processes go beyond restoring peace and rebuilding. It also goes about addressing the systemic issues that contribute to these conflicts. For Sierra Leone, coming specifically to Sierra Leone as an example, our state building efforts included peace building, strengthening institutions to address justice, security, corruption, accountability, addressing public financial management, and dealing with oversight bodies such as Parliament, Audit Service Agency, to strengthen them to perform a better role in state building. And a positive result that we witness in the public sector management, the financial management, is the development of systems to the extent that many of the partners that we work with now feel confident to use the national systems which strengthen national ownership. Another area is partnership. The immediate aftermath of the war, we did strengthen partnerships. I did talk about earlier on today about the Development Partnership Committee. And this committee actually evolved from the Relief and Recovery Committee that was established during the war, that during the conflict, that met on a fortnightly basis to give updates on relief, mainly relief, conflict, relief issues, and success in rehabilitation. And even in state building, I think these partnerships are key. I would like to probably refute a comment or observation made by Tobias about ambition. I think in partnership, we can be ambitious. And I would say that because very recently, I discussed with a partner organization about an activity that I felt needed to be carried out. And we had a good discussion, but at the end, the partner said to me, yeah, it's a good idea. Your ambitious plan, yeah, it's a good idea. But after we assessed the outcome of that meeting with a member of my staff, he said that, oh, that was development speak to say that you can't do it. And it was a difficult task, but we did do it because we were determined. And that partner congratulated us. So if there's ambition on both sides, I think it's possible. And you could use now the traction of these fora to bring others on board. And I think a lot can be achieved. Lessons learned, the process of achieving the desired results. There's a comment also that was made by Nigel that I would like to speak to, and that was is about staying engaged. The process of achieving these results and the many successes I just highlighted took quite a long time. It was a long period, but it shows that short-term solutions are never the answer. Usually, development partners do look for quick results. After the conflict, we bring in consultants because we say the systems are not strong enough. But this is at the expense of building local capacities. And many, many projects and interventions collapsed when the funding dried up and the international consultants left. This goes to underscore the point that state building is a painstaking process, as you yourself mentioned, that requires nurturing of local skills and building institutions for sustainable results. And this is why, as the G7 Plus, members are happy to see state building back on the agenda and bringing these efforts to the fore to address fragility. So I do not see an end to state building as an intervention. Probably we could add more innovative strategies, but state building needs to be core. I see state building being, I regard state building as an imperative for addressing the plight of over 1.5 billion people living in a situation of fragility. So in the light of, well, some of the challenges highlighted, but also some of the impacts, the positive impacts that could be achieved. Abandoning state building as an intervention would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we should not, and it should not be an option. Rather, there needs to be a continuous engagement and commitment to pursuing best practices, taking into cognizance country-led initiatives. Yes.
Thank you, Minister. It's a strong case you made for continuing state building, and there were two words that you used that I think that I heard as important. You dwelled on partnership, which I think is very important, and we tend to use assistance, and assistance can be seen in some sense as a pejorative word. It's somehow we're going to fix things, we're going to assist you to do it, and a partnership I think is a better concept, if you will, for moving forward. Let's turn to our final speaker, Dr. Al-Haiti. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark, and my gratitude extend to the speakers who flourish our mind about what's happening around the world, and is nearly the case in Iraq. If we speak about the state building to be done better, we have, in fact, to focus on two parts. I call it internal part, by ensuring that the citizens' right very well respected and preserved. It's very important. This means that regardless of the ideology we are trying to change for building our state better, need to come from citizens, which will be accomplished once they feel that they are part of this change. Once they feel that their right to live a respective life is not a favor of the government gives for them, but the government has to provide such food, quality of education, quality of shelter, and infrastructure structure is their duties to the nation. This is not a favor. The external part, the international community, the donors and the transformation supporter need to have a clear objective, such as when asking themselves, how can state building be done better? What are the objectives we are trying to achieve by this title? In Iraq context, we noticed that the idea of trying to separate democracy in Iraq in 2003 was highly costly, both human life and resources. Yet until now, there is a big debate in the democracy promoter if they have achieved their objectives. The answer is very complicated due to many reasons. What was or were the objectives of building a state better in Iraq? First, it's like a question and answer. If the objective was to promote cultural change in Iraq, the new state did not bring any new thing to the country, a country with a deep and rich culture. Second, if the objective was to promote a religious change, we have now more extremism in Iraq, like the occupation about 46% of the Iraqi land by the ISIS. Third, if the objective was due to personal, leader versus leader or system versus system, then from leader to a leader, but we used to have one dictator in the past, while now Iraq has many dictators and mass number of parties in which burden the government. Fourth, if objective was to get rid of mass destruction weapon, as it was announced in the beginning, it was proven Iraq did not have any. So the objective was very subjective. and unfair to the citizens.
Dr. El-Hiti, your connection is breaking up, so maybe turn your video off so we can hear your audio.
Objective was to promote appropriate state is willing to a key point.
Can you hear me, Dr.
For
El-Hiti?
example,
You've turned your audio off, not your video. So we can see you, but now we can't hear you. So can we do it the other way?
sorry. So again, it was only citizens who suffered from poorness from the sanction. It was the health and the education system. Once Iraq in the mid-80s, it was the state number one in education and health system. While the regime did have
Okay, can you turn your video off, perhaps?
all the money, while if we actually, which the international community used more diplomacy in any way of respecting the religion, the culture, and the political system was considered like in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, in which a win-win situation was promoted for a transformation and major changes. Yes, we see those countries did have the experience of building a state better and did experience economic transformation. Now, I think and I hope that after those major and big changes that happened in the region, the international community and transformation promoters ensure that they read and learn from the history of the new and upcoming changes. Change cannot be external. Change requires an internal like a medicine molecule have to couple. Hello? Hi.
We can still hear you, Dr. El-Hiti. Continue speaking.
Yeah. That's to say, medicine molecule have to couple or interact with the right receptor inside the body at the right concentration to return all the organs to the normal healthy state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. El-Hiti.
Okay.
We appreciate your comments. We didn't get them entirely, but certainly I took away this notion that the objective has to be clear when the partnership comes in, and if the objective is not in concert with the domestic objectives, change can't happen because change must inherently be internal. So the external must be a partnership to that internal change, but cannot impose a change that's not wanted. So 4 very interesting presentations. Happy to open the floor. We have about 10 minutes left for comments and questions. If you have a question and you're in the room, please line up at the microphone. I welcome someone to be brave. I have someone coming up already, and we'll get some questions. For those of you who are listening online, I believe there's a question button where you can submit your questions, and those will get read to me in due course. Sir, please, can you identify yourself and then ask your question? Thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you all for being here. Name is Eric Leese. I work at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So kind of a general question, going back to what Tobias Hawk was saying, and then how do you balance the need to demonstrate the positive but short-term results, especially when you're talking about having more modest goals, with the longer time frames that you're advocating for, especially given the short attention span of, the donor countries? Public support is fleeting at times, and the money dries up, like you were all talking about. How do you balance that need for something needs to change now, and it needs to be big enough to see, with we need to be measured and slowly work at things to actually make it sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you. Does someone want to take that? Minister, perhaps.
And I think
What's that?
it was referring to Tobias's statement, but since I had already responded to your statement previously, or commented on your statement, I think you're talking about more of the long-term ambitious programs. And so I would say, personally, have that long-term goal, but then you also have along the timeline, you have shorter bite-sized pieces that you can deal with, but all working towards this long-term goal. That would be my thoughts. But as a country, as a government, we have our vision, our long-term vision, and we have our medium-term plans. But as you say, donor support sometimes just comes 2-3 years. So we take it, but we do it within the bigger picture and the long-term vision. That's how I would address it as a planning minister.
Nigel?
Shall I add? It's on? Okay. I think from a donor perspective, it's not as difficult as that question sounds, if you choose the stuff that you can do well. So if you, for example, focus on service delivery and certain kinds of infrastructure or certain kinds of community development programs, things that the bank generally knows how to do well, you can get short-term results in the process of a longer-term development process. So I don't see a contradiction between those two objectives unless you're choosing the wrong stuff to do. And that's the basic problem that we've been talking about. Many of the more ambitious things aren't going to work either in the short or the long term.
Tobias, do you want to come in at all?
No, just to, I think Nigel's put it very well, and I think it picks up on the point that Minister Bale made as well. I mean, I think that the argument, take Afghanistan, for example. There's no doubt that the World Bank and the international community did an excellent job in improving access to primary healthcare. That's something we did incredibly well. We did it incredibly fast, and it expanded people's life expectancy, and it changed the lives of millions of people. Okay, but I think when I'm saying let's be a little less ambitious, what I'm saying is let's not pretend that short-term development interventions can also create a democratic and accountable state, despite the broader political context and political pressures that may be present. Let's not pretend that we can create a vibrant market economy when the fundamental underpinnings of that may be missing, in terms of property rights, in terms of the extent to which the donor intervention itself is distorting the economy. So I'm not saying for an instant that we shouldn't try and do things that matter, or that we can't do things that matter. I'm saying that let's be clear on what our objectives are, and let's be clear that while we can do development and deliver services and deliver certain kinds of infrastructure, the fundamental goals of societal transformation that implicitly have imbued state-building efforts, especially during the 1990s and recent decades, I think those are the ones that I'm encouraging some reconsideration of, right? So it's the societal transformation objectives. Let's focus on the development in terms of service delivery and the things that we know we can do.
Thank you. Can we go to the next question, please?
Hi, Alison Miner, the Brookings Institution. This question is for Nigel. I appreciated your focus on the need to acknowledge geopolitical and political imperatives. I think that too often in these kind of settings, we don't confront those political issues as directly as you did. I'm curious if you could speak a bit more to how you think the bank should address those outside of the Palestinian case that you looked at most closely. It seems to me that with growing multipolarity, with major donors increasingly focused on development assistance to serve national security priorities, that these political imperatives are only going to get more difficult and perhaps even competing with each other. So in those cases, how should the bank operate? And perhaps clarifying, do you think it can remain purely technical? Thank you.
It isn't purely technical. There are political implications to everything we do. But I think the point I was making earlier is that I think that the neutral technocratic ethos of the bank resides with its staff. They're the custodians of that, not the board. And I think it's important to understand the different roles that different parts of the institution play. And doing that job well as a staff member means understanding the politics, understanding the political nuances, and presenting the programmatic and the project implications of those to the decision makers who are the board. And I think that the problem that we have as staff members very often is that we take the easy route. We kind of read the runes and see what we think the board is going to say, and then we lean into that and conform to it. And that, to me, is not doing our job. I think in many cases, these complications, these contradictions need to be put to the decision makers. You need to make their decision-making process difficult, and therefore give them the responsibility of handling complex information and analysis, which we're pretty good at producing.
Any questions online? No, I'm getting a no. Anyone else, please? We have a couple more minutes. I encourage you. If not, maybe I'll do my usual trick of turning to each of the panelists and asking for, you've heard each other intervene. What do you take in one, maybe two sentences? What do you take away? What's changed a bit in your thought? How would you summarize? And maybe I'll go, I don't know, is Dr. El-Haiti still online? Can we tell? Well, let me go to the minister then. And then Nigel. Oh, you are?
Yes. Again,
so
I think any external changes to anything in any country, unless it has what you call it, internal willingness, it cannot work. All the countries which we have mentioned, it was an outside invention or intervention in the country. It doesn't work. The bank, I mean, yes, we can do the reconstruction and all, but it is very costly. And then the regime or the new state is still fragile. So I think unless you share the citizen with their, what you call it, views, and as we said, win-win situation like what had happened in a very political, good way, diplomatic way in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to interact between the nation themselves and the, what you call it, external willingness to change the economy, and then the economy of the people, then it wouldn't work and will have a fragile state. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El-Haiti. Thank you, Dr. El-Haiti. Minister.
I don't think it's any of the discussions have changed my view in any way, but it also indicates the need for greater reflection in all of the areas. But I would like to support or I agree with the previous speaker that whatever change that we're looking for has to be internal. I was thinking more of the higher level vision of the president and we as government leaders, but also the issue that he just brought up, maybe to also reflect a little bit more widely on the community's input and their level as well, that they need to be also at the core of state building. And just to reemphasize the need for these partnerships. And but I think I said it before that, and you said partnerships, the partners should support the government's vision, because also the government's vision is to progress in state building, improve the state as a whole, improve the livelihoods of the population.
Thank you, Minister. Nigel.
So listening to Minister Bale and Mr. Al-Haiti reminds me of just, and I didn't really stress this in my remarks, just how important it is to listen carefully and try to understand local perceptions of politics and the way that societies operate. That's where you get the reality check, not from inside the institutions that we work in. But that also requires a change in how an institution like this deploys its staff. You don't acquire that knowledge from here. The political reality check comes from constant field work. And I don't just mean sitting in a bank office in a capital. That's not something we do. It's not something we're financed to do. We have far too low a risk tolerance when it comes to deploying our staff into difficult situations, just at the time when we increasingly brand ourselves as an institution that deals with conflict. These things don't quite add up. But you just reminded me that it's the local understanding, wisdom, and experience that can make the difference between really sharp and realistic political analysis and program design and the stuff that we do that doesn't work so well.
Thank you. Tobias, you have the last word.
I'm very, very brief. I mean, I think there's a lot of coherence in what's been said. I mean, in my view, essentially, the idea is that ultimate change to some of these fundamental social dynamics will come from the place itself. It will come from the people themselves. And that's not something that can be imposed externally. So if we're working in a place where those underlying political conditions are not conducive, and that limits what can be done. If the broader politics are not conducive, we have to be very honest about what can be achieved with development interventions. If everything is pulling in the right direction and everything can work together, then that's great. But if the fundamental political context, whether that's domestic, whether that's international, is going to constrain some of our broader and more ambitious objectives, we need to be honest about that. We need to be modest about that. And we need to say what can be done and what can't be done, or else we find ourselves in a situation where we are fooling not just ourselves, but also our shareholders. So let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tobias. And let me thank... Hello, there we go. Let me thank our online audience for participating, and let me ask our local audience to join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent intervention. Thank you. And I'm told to encourage you to attend the next session, but I don't know what the next session is, but I encourage you nonetheless. Thank you.
I will use that opportunity to say that our next session, which is our Changemaker session, has been rescheduled. And this is a very inopportune time for me to be chewing gum, but it's been rescheduled for